Welcome everybody here or online. I'm Magda Tedder. I'm the Shtetl Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our another program here at Law School, with which we've been partnering for years. It is a real pleasure to have David and Nomi here. Neither Nomi nor David are strangers to Fordham. Some of you, if you've been coming to our events long enough, will remember David's fabulous three-part series on Israel and Palestine, a different take with Hussein Ibish, which is one of my greatest regrets that it was in the era where we were not recording, and we don't have a record of this fantastic series, but we're plotting to do an encore, so I hope we'll do it. And Nomi has been here at Fordham Law School a number of times, so welcome back. And I'm really excited that they will be joined by Abner Green from Fordham Law School, who has also written on this topic. The program is co-presented by our Center for Jewish Studies and Fordham University School of Law and its Institute on Religion, Law, and Lawyers' Work, and also the Seminar on Jewish Orthodoxies. We are grateful to our partners, and we also want to express our gratitude to all the friends of our center, as well as the members of the advisory board, for your generosity, interest, and support. We were proud of the enthusiasm and vote of confidence just earlier this week during the Fordham Giving Day. I was grateful that we beat the awesome basketball team in the number of donors. And when I called, let's catch up with the football team, we did, but damn, they scored a little higher than we did. But still, I'm very, very happy, and I'm grateful to all of you for being part of our learning community. I also am grateful to Shavan Berletza, who makes everything works, and Sarit Katan-Gribetz, who couldn't be with us here, who is my amazing partner co-directing the center. Before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to draw your attention to two events next week, and there will be still a couple in May. On Tuesday, April 25th at 10 a.m. in the morning, there will be a student-faculty workshop at the Rose Hill campus with Rivka Alitzur-Lehman on ancient amulets and Jewish daily life. And then on Thursday, April 1st, on this campus at 1 p.m., so our unusual time, Amy Wise will be speaking on Realigning Faith, American Jews, Protestants, and Israel, 1945 to 2020. And it's a public lecture, part of our joint research fellowship program with the Center of Jewish History, which David and I started a few years ago. So yet another connection. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Nomi Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lily Chappell Chair at the University of Southern California Gold School of Law. She's a legal scholar whose research spans a range of interdisciplinary interests, including law and religion, law and liberalism, law and feminism, law and psychoanalysis, and law and literature. And I'm really excited about connecting with you, Nomi. After getting her JD at Harvard Law School in 1987 and clerking for the Honorable John Gibbons, Chief Justice of the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, she joined the faculty of the USC Gold School in 1988. There, she helped establish the USC Center of Law, History, and Culture, one of the preeminent centers for the study of law and the humanities. She's the co-author with David Myers of American Shtetl, the Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic Village in the Upstate New York, which we'll be hearing about today. And she's also the author of numerous articles on law and religion, including the widely cited He Drew a Circle That Shuts Me Out, Assimilation, Indoctrination, and the Paradox of a Liberal Education, which was published in the Harvard Law Review, as well as writing the relationship between race and religion in law, which is of particular interest to me, and the return of religion, legal secularism, rise and fall, and possible resurrection. She's spending this year as a visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at University of Pennsylvania, where she is working on a new project on religious exemptions and theory of faith-based discrimination. David Myers has also a long biography. He asked me to shorten it. He's a distinguished professor of history and Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair of Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as the director of the UCLA Laskin Center for History and Policy, and also directs the new UCLA initiative on the to study hate. He is the author and editor of many books, very important, very influential on history, historiography, Zionism, and in the most recent one, again, which we're discussing tonight, American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel. David has served is now also serving as the president of the New Israel Fund. And finally, last but not least, our colleague Abner Green, who is the Leonard F. Manning Professor of Law and who specializes in administrative and regulatory law, constitutional law, freedom of speech and the press, law and philosophy, religion and the law, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. And Abner has published widely in various law journals, including about Kiryas Joel, which is why we're all here today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers tonight. The floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Magda. It's really a great pleasure to be back here with you. I should say, as someone who grew up in a town where the intellectuals in the city were Jesuits at the local university, I feel very much at home at Fordham. And have had so many enjoyable and enriching evenings here. I want to thank you, Sarit, Siobhan, and of course Abner for joining once again on this subject that so intrigues the three of us, at least, and we hope more of you. We're going to speak very briefly, Nomi and I, and then we really want to hear what Abner has to say, and then I gather we'll open up for a broader discussion. But I want to begin by just talking about what drew me to the subject in the first place. A Hasidic community that became a legally recognized village and then town in the state of New York. There's been one of the most vigorous debates about our book is whether or not Kiryas Joel is in upstate New York or not. The definition of upstate. That has drawn a wide range of perspectives, and we can discuss that a bit later. But I'm essentially an intellectual historian who studies typically unpublished or published texts of people from the distant past. This is a project that required me to, in some sense, really re-equip myself, because it required dealing with very live human subjects, a very different proposition. And I have to say, it was by many orders of magnitude the most interesting research project that I've been involved in my life. Our wondrous, distinguished colleague, Ayala, does this every day of her life and does it with extraordinary distinction. We're interlopers on the domains of traditionalist Orthodox Haredi culture and society. And I should say it's been just an extraordinary excursion journey intellectually and from the perspective of our scholarship. One of the things that drew us to Kiryas Joel, and I should say, Nomi is not only my writing partner, but my life partner, in case there were any lingering questions about that. So she, for a long time, has been interested in the place of religious subcommunities on the landscape of the United States. I noticed at one point that she was interested in a small community of Hasidic Jews in suburban rural upstate New York, members of the Satmar Hasidic group, and said to her, maybe we can think about writing something together. And it took a little bit of time to persuade her that that would be a good idea. And then it took us about 15 years to research and write the book. But what really drew us to the subject was our shared interest in the struggle, the attempt, in this case, of Jews to assert a strong form of collective identity in the modern age when there are all sorts of countervailing vectors seeking to, in some sense, dissolve that strong form of collectivity. They can range from liberal assimilationism on one hand to totalitarian fascism, both of which have been present in the modern journey of the Jews. And so we were very interested in how is it that a community such as this, a community of pious, observant Jews, could create a very strong form of religious subcommunity, see it flourish, and then receive legal recognition from the state as a form of what we call local sovereignty. This struck me as an example largely without precedent in modern Jewish history. That is to say, we know of an entity comprised of Jews that has achieved a strong form of collective identity and even sovereignty in the form of the state of Israel. And we know of experiments like Bijan in the former Soviet Union, which drew on the ethos of diaspora autonomism, an ideology that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But a fully functioning form of local sovereignty, such as Kiryas Joel, really struck us as distinctive and perhaps unique. And my task was to try to understand how this could come about. And I want to just amplify that by saying a word about the title of our book, American Shtetl. Okay? Shtetl, right? Yiddish term meaning little town, diminutive from the Yiddish Stott, connected to the German Stadt. When we conjure up the idea of a Shtetl, what often comes to mind is the kind of mythic world of Fiddler on the Roof. Historians have studied Shtetl across Eastern and East Central Europe now for decades and have arrived at the conclusion that that mythic ideal bears very little resemblance to the actual historical Shtetl, which was always part of a much larger cultural, political, and economic ecosystem in which non-Jews were amply present. A Eastern European Shtetl never achieved the degree of religious homogeneity that Kiryas Joel has. That simply was an impossibility. A Shtetl, a neighborhood, a concentration of Jews in an Eastern European locale was marked by explosive heterogeneity. So we were interested in this seeming anomaly of Kiryas Joel taking rise, Dafka especially, on American soil. What gives here? This seemed to be a mystery, and that really is what set us out about on this task of understanding Kiryas Joel. We'll alternatively refer to the community as Kiryas Joel, KJ, so just follow the shifting nomenclature. The story turned out to be supremely interesting. It takes us back to the 19th century, to the northeast quadrant of the late Austro-Hungarian Empire, particularly in northeast Hungary, known as the Hungarian Unterland, which was one of the most interesting laboratories for the emergence of a new form of Judaism, what we call Haredi Judaism, from the Hebrew word to tremble, which has biblical roots, trembling in the presence of God. This was a form of Judaism that regarded the advent of modernity as the greatest threat to the continuity of Judaism that the world had seen, that regarded modern forces of innovation as sources of contamination and pollution, and that adopted an active and self-conscious anti-modern sensibility. So a modern phenomenon with an anti-modern agenda. One of the most distinguished set of exemplars of this new form of Judaism, which emerges really at the crossroads of forces of neo-pietism that we associate with Hasidism and forces of enlightenment, sort of a juncture of the meeting forces coming from east and west there in the Hungarian Unterland. One of the most distinguished series of representatives was a family known as the Teitelbaum family, whose progenitor was a rabbi and convert to this new neo-pietist movement called Hasidism, known as the Yismach Moshe, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum from the early 19th century. He really inaugurated this tradition, family tradition of combatants for a Torah true Judaism that resisted the impulses of modernity. Fast forward to the late 19th century, we have his descendant, Rabbi Joel, a man not born as a rabbi, but Joel Teitelbaum, who assumed a number of rabbinical positions in this very interesting area, where, especially in the aftermath of the First World War, kept flipping back in terms of its name. So the area was Hungary before 1920, then in the Treaty of Trianon became Romania, and a number of other newly established successor states to the dismantled Austro-Hungarian Empire. The descendant of Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum assumes positions throughout Eastern Europe and brings his particular brand of a fierce commitment to tradition to all of the communities he serves, including a community in now Hungary after 1920 known as Satu Mare, which came from the Hungarian term Satmar. And thus is born one of the late branches of Hasidism known as Satmar Hasidism, which some believe is to be the largest Hasidic group in the world today, or one of the two largest. Rabbi Teitelbaum, Joel Teitelbaum, has relatively little time in Satmar, in Satu Mare. He only arrives there in 1934, and then in 1944, the Nazi German forces invade Hungary. The area had reverted to Hungary after 1940, and the community is decimated. Rabbi Teitelbaum survives, actually initially in Bergen-Belsen for a period, then in Switzerland, then in Palestine, ironically enough, because he was a ferocious opponent of Zionism, which he saw as one of those forms of modern pollutions that must be resisted, and then made his way to the United States, settles in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, and begins to build up a community, really drawn initially from the tattered fragments of the survivor community that made its way to the United States. Already at the beginning, Rabbi Teitelbaum says, we are going to need a place of refuge outside of the city, away from the seductions and allures of a teeming urban environment, in order to preserve our way of life, and in order to find affordable housing as well. And thus began the quest to find an area outside of the city where there could be a kind of spiritual enclave, not in lieu of, but alongside the Satmar presence in Williamsburg. And after a 25-year search, the associates of Rabbi Teitelbaum found a piece of land in the town of Monroe in Orange County, began to build garden apartments and 25 single-family homes. And in 1974, the first Satmar Hasidim began to move from Brooklyn to this suburban enclave. Almost immediately, tensions surface with local authorities in Monroe, largely over zoning, what constitutes a single-family house, what's permissible to put in a garden apartment. Is it permissible to put a matzah bakery or a ritual bath or a kindergarten? These are the kinds of questions that arose and that ultimately led, after threats of litigation back and forth, to the decision to allow this group of Hasidic Jews to carve out a village within the town of Monroe. You can create a village out of a town in the state of New York. Not a village out of a village, but a village out of a town. And thus was born Kiryas Joel, New York, the village of Joel, named after the charismatic founding Rebbe of the Satmar Hasidic community. Nomi, tell me how am I doing on time?
It's over.
It's over. Okay. So what I want to say in conclusion is this. What's so interesting, there are many markers of success that define this community from its inception in 1974 and then its incorporation in 1977. Just demographically, it begins with 800 residents, I think, in the 1980 census, and they're now over 33,000 residents, almost all of whom, with the exception of a handful, are Satmar Hasidic Jews. This is just one of the markers of success of the community. And yet one of the most interesting phenomena that we can identify in the history of Kiryas Joel is that its growth has been accompanied by conflict and strife at almost every turn, which leads us to a somewhat counterintuitive, albeit provisional conclusion, which is strife or conflict has been good for the growth of this community. It's not been a deterrent, it has been a stimulus. And on that note, having gone over, I'll hand things over to Nomi.
Well, first of all, I want to add my thanks to our hosts for organizing this and for bringing us here. It's really good to be back. So what David has described, a community characterized by this intense degree of religious homogeneity, an intense degree of separatism, right? Insularity, success in its aspiration to withdraw from mainstream society and insulate itself from exposure, as David said, to the seductions of the outside world. Also characterized by an intensely effective degree of internal control within the community exercised by the religious institutions, the religious leadership. And furthermore, it's politically empowered. It's a community that, after sending out this satellite from the city into the suburbs, so at the point of origin, this is a private association, it's a private community. But not long after this community's arrival in the suburbs, as the result of clashes with the pre-existing community, largely conflicts over zoning and land use, it's a community that then succeeds in transforming itself from a purely private community into a municipality, into a legally incorporated, officially recognized village, a subdivision of the state, the village of Kiryas Joel. And 10 years later, at the end of the 1980s, it also succeeds in establishing its own public school district. And as David has said, those characteristics of a Jewish community, far from being a recreation of the Shtetl of yore, the Shtetl of the European Shtetl, the historic Shtetl, this is actually unprecedented. That's the main point that David was making in the annals of Jewish history. But in the annals of American history, this phenomenon of a separatist, religiously homogeneous community succeeding in establish its own institutions of certainly private government, and in some instances, even before the establishment of Kiryas Joel, translating its private existence into the form of a public community, that's anything but unprecedented in the annals of American history. So I'm going to try to keep my points brief because I know that Abner has not only comments, but some questions. And I think much of what I have to say will be more pointed and interesting in response to Abner's question. So I'm just going to, so the main point I want to share with you, just by way of introduction, is how, in contrast to its unprecedented nature, relative to the history of Jews, particularly in Europe, this is actually very consistent with many American traditions. It's reflective of and consistent with long-standing American traditions, most obviously of religious association, right? American history from the very beginning, from colonial times, is replete with examples of intensive, homogeneous, oftentimes separatist religious communities establishing their own private enclaves, living apart from others. But it's also reflective not only of a tradition of religious associations, but also a tradition of local governments. In at least one case, even a state government, Utah, being formed by homogeneous religious communities through what we call the private pathway to political empowerment and to the creation of public governmental entities. What we mean by private is, in the first instance, private property, right? So this is as much a story about the tradition of America's commitment to the rights of private property as it is about America's commitment to freedom of religion. So that's one way in which this is a very typical American story, reflective of centuries old American traditions. But we also talk about how there were changes taking place in American society and in American politics and in American law in the period of time when the village of Kiryas Joel was being formed, the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, that were particularly conducive to this kind of separatist, politically empowered endeavor. This is a period of time characterized by retreat from what my good friend and colleague Abner calls the centripetal values of integration into a common culture. Think Brown versus Board, right? If you think the 50s and 60s, we can look back. Those decades were the high point of what in retrospect was perhaps a fairly short-lived era of commitment to the centripetal values of integration into a common culture. The 70s and 80s were characterized by retreat from that value and a growing embrace of what Abner calls the centrifugal values, or others might call communitarian values. That's in good measure a story about the rise of the religious right, and more specifically, the new Christian right, a coalition of conservative evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics that really begins in the 60s, but becomes a highly visible and effective political force in the 70s, really precisely when the village is being formed. And so that's a big part of the story that we tell in the book. But I do want to, in closing these introductory remarks, I'd be remiss not to say, as we say in the book, it's not only on the right that we saw a retreat from the value of integration. There were also many movements on the left that likewise were questioning the melting pot ideal, recharacterizing the ideal of integration into a common culture as a highly questionable form of enforced assimilation, hegemony. So we seek to tell that story. That is to say, the story about how Kiryas Joel takes place, the formation of the village takes rise in a culture that is in many ways extremely hospitable to this kind of separatist endeavor. And perhaps having said that, that may seem, I hope you're nodding, but that's also in many ways a very counterintuitive argument. Because there are many people at the time and still today who say the exact opposite, who look at the creation of this village and say, this is completely contrary to American values. This is completely contrary to the traditions and principles that are embodied in the Constitution. And indeed, that point of view is what motivated the litigation that began in the early 1990s after the state of New York enacted a statute allowing the village to create its own public school district. There was a lawsuit that said, this is a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment that says there shall be no state established religion. This is unconstitutional. This is violative of American constitutional values. And it was that case that really brought the community to wide attention. The case was handed down in 1994. I joined a small band of First Amendment scholars who wrote about the case, another of whom was Abner, who really wrote what remains one of the finest analyses of the Supreme Court case. So I'm going to hand the podium over to Abner, hear what he has to say, and then perhaps we'll both respond and then open up for questions.
Thanks, Nomi. That's great. Thank you all. Thanks for organizing. And thank you guys for coming. It's great to see you again. So this is a great book that we'll display it too for those of you who don't have it. It's big, it's thick, it's got a lot of stuff in it. I love books with stuff. There's a lot to learn in it, and it's very impressive. I knew you guys were working on it for a long time, but it shows it. I mean, in a nice way. So I sent Nomi and David some questions yesterday, so they would be able to think about them, and I'm going to make some comments which will incorporate the questions, and then I think I'm going to do all of it at once, and then can go through all the questions at once. So for me, as a legal constitutional law First Amendment scholar, my main interest in a critical sense in this book is something that I've been interested in Nomi's work in the past in particular, which is what I will call paradox theory. Nomi Stolzenberg is all about paradox. And so, you know, the big paradox that Nomi and David point out in this book is the paradox of the separatist group using the sort of public forms of power. Now, a paradox is a seeming contradiction. It's the definition of the word. And so throughout the book, I kept circling the word paradox and the word irony and the word tension, which are words that are used a lot in different ways in the book, but primarily about this point about sort of, isn't it odd that this group that wants to be alone is using village incorporation law and civil litigation to achieve their ends? And I guess my main response to that is it's not so odd. It's only odd if we think that the baseline of non-oddness is pureness. Like pureness, like to be separate in a pure way would be what? To find some land to move into, to have no one around you, to have no one bother you, to have no, I mean, now internet is a whole big problem. But if we think that's hard to do in a country like the US, you're inevitably going to be coming into connection with your neighbors, and there'll be questions about your schools and about your, you know, what kind of, do you have a village? Do I living part of the village? There's necessarily going to be some interplay of the private separate group and the forms of power. So I guess one thought that I have is that I just don't necessarily see it as I mean, it's interesting to point this out, but I'm not sure it's a paradox. Would the book be different if it talked about this not as paradox, but as predictable compromises in the heterogeneous liberal state? That wasn't one of the questions I asked you, but I'll throw that out there. So the first question I have, and all of my questions you'll note are sort of normative, evaluative, critical questions. One of the things about the book, which I liked, is that the book is very careful at all sorts of points to step back from offering normative, evaluative, critical comments. You sort of think initially, oh, they're going to say something about this, and they don't. And that's super interesting, and they can explain to us why they made that decision. But I'm going to ask some questions to sort of out you, as it were. So my first question was, would it have been different if you just saw these as predictable compromises? My next question, which I did send you, is, are you critical of these paradoxes? That is, you describe them, but are you in any way critical of the fact that this group that was trying to be a separatist group is in fact using all of this public in a general sense? So that's that. Turning to another issue. So the case that SCOTUS decided struck down the special school district. There were 3 separate grounds. The first one, which attracted only 4 votes, was based on a case called Larkin versus Grendel's Den. And basically the concern there was that the group, qua religious group, had gained control of the town, qua public town, and that kind of intermingling of religious power and public power is unconstitutional. That only got 4 votes. In my article, I explained that, at least as this case was litigated, that's wrong, was litigated on summary judgment motions, not on any significant discovery. And so there wasn't any proof actually that the Satmar were running the town or the school district as a religious town or a religious school district. The next argument that the court went to was the so-called singling out argument. This was the one argument that got 5 votes, that the New York State had singled out a particular religious group for this special accommodation, and that was problematic. And I have a whole argument where I think that's wrong. It deals with problems as it deals with them. There's no reason to think they wouldn't have dealt with the problem same for other groups. And the third argument, which Justice Kennedy advanced in a separate thing, which is quite interesting, was that he called this religious gerrymandering. He believed that the state had, in a way, gerrymandered this school district around religious lines. And I critiqued that mainly on the argument that, Brown v. Board sort of concerns about racial segregation and gerrymandering is because it's enforced by the majority against the minority. Here, the state was coming to the aid of a small minority who wanted this school district created for various reasons. And I think that makes a big difference. So my next question for Nomi and David, if they want to answer it, is what do they think of the court's decision? They never actually say whether they agree with it or not. And to the Larkin v. Grendel's Den point, to what extent do we have an actual intermingling of private religious power and public power? That's a super interesting issue, which they document very well in the book. It comes up again and again and again with regard to the village, with regard to the school. And they also say nicely that there were some matters in litigation that could have resolved this, but for various sort of, I'll call them procedural reasons, including settlement, the civil court, the U.S. judges who never had to resolve this. And so I wonder what Nomi and David think would be sufficient evidence to say that the group is in violation of the Establishment Clause in the way that they're running the town. The next item I wanted to mention was Nomi and David's use of liberalism. They talk about liberalism primarily in terms of private market capitalism. There's a lot in the book about the Satmar use of private property to gain what they need. And they talk a lot about what you might call individualism or libertarianism. And I just sort of wonder whether that's the best way to think about this. I have an article I recently published in the Buffalo Law Review called The Dilemma of Liberal Pluralism, where one of the main things I argue is that liberalism, I think, actually contains pluralism. Whether we can think about liberalism not so much in terms of private market capitalism or libertarianism, although that may be there, but that a core part of liberalism is accommodation. That liberalism was born in accommodating religious minorities and that should continue in our U.S. setting as well. In connection to this argument about liberal pluralism, there's an important issue about exit rights, and this is something also that Nomi and David talk about a little bit in their book. It's sort of tantalizing. It's sort of like leading up to maybe another article. You sort of sense when you get to this part. One of the big issues, of course, for private religious groups that are wanting to live on their own is to what extent are there do people, when they become adults, able to actually exit the group? There's a lot of writing on this. I write about it in this article I just published. As many of us see it, there has to be sufficient voluntariness and knowing. Voluntary and knowing are usually the two conditions for exercising a right. And I think that the voluntariness may be present if we think about voluntariness and coercion in a sort of formal sense, but the big issue may be the knowing issue, because it's not clear how much education the kids are getting in private school, especially the way Nomi and David pointed out. The girls may be getting more, but the boys are getting primarily traditional education. So these are issues, as you know, if you've been reading the paper, are coming up in with the state, New York State's dealing with private religious schools. My colleague Aaron Sager has written some about this. He's here today. And so I was wondering if I could ask Nomi and David, again, this is stuff that goes beyond what's in the book, but I'm curious, what do you think would be sufficient for us to deem exit from the opportunity for exit from Kiryas Joel, sufficient both in terms of U.S. common law, or maybe more generally in terms of political theory? So it's a fabulous book. There's a bunch of observations and questions, and thank you for bringing it to us.
Thank you, Abner. So maybe I'll go up and then we'll take turns. And okay, so Abner's asked for very pointed questions. The first is the judgment question. And then the other three are all really, okay, so what is our judgment? And can he succeed in outing us? One is the Grummet question. That's the name of the Supreme Court case. What do we have a judgment about that decision? I forgot one of my pages.
There you go.
So there's the judgment question. That's number one. Number two, what is our judgment? Do we have one of the court decision? Then there's the Establishment Clause question. Do we have a judgment? Is Kiryas Joel, the village of Kiryas Joel, a religious establishment in violation of the First Amendment? And then fourth, the liberalism question. Okay. And so you're not the first person to observe, and oftentimes the observation is not merely an observation, but a criticism, but not that you were. You're so scrupulously neutral. Why, you're so non-judgmental. And
in either direction.
Yeah, in
and
either,
way, I
in
thought it
either
was a big
direction.
plus in this book.
And David will have
Frankly.
his turn to respond to this. I don't want to scoop David, but I will. I'm sorry. David often says, our aim was neither to condone nor condemn. I would add, I would put the point this way with respect to judgment. And let me just we were just with our dear friend Daniel Sokach, who's the author of a book called Can We Talk About Israel? And he gets the same. He said, people say I'm irritatingly neutral. And so we're like, we get that comment all the time too. So we're like in the irritatingly neutral club. But I would put it this way, again, it's odd because both David and I in our previous work and subsequent work we believe in the critique of neutrality. We don't actually believe in the existence of neutrality, either as scholars, as a scholarly matter, or as a political matter. And that will take us to the liberalism question. So the way I would put it is, it's not that we are seeking to avoid judgment, but what we are really trying to do in this book is to inform judgment in two senses. First of all, we want judgments to be informed by a more accurate and richer understanding of what it is that is being judged. And there's a lot of just lack of knowledge, and a lot of, I think, misconceptions and misunderstandings. And I think it behooves all of us to have a richer, more textured understanding of whatever it is we're judging before we judge it. So that's sort of a matter of timing. It's not do we judge, but when do we judge? We also seek in this book to address the question of what is the proper object of judgment. Is it just the Satmars, the village of Kiryas Joel? We seek to widen the scope of the object that is being judged to include what I was talking about in my introductory remarks. If there's something, whether it's something you admire in this community or something that revolts you, whatever it is, you should be clear that that thing that inspires or revolts you, as the case may be, isn't just the Satmar community. Because the point you made, because the Satmar community, despite its aspirations for separatism, and in many ways that's a real thing, but it doesn't exist in isolation. So if you are critical of whatever it is, you think it's too internally coercive, the liberalism choice exit problem, or you think it's too exclusionary, well, then what you should be criticizing is not just the Satmars, but those features of American society and American law that I began to talk about that enable and indeed encourage that kind of exclusionary separating yourself out from other people. Or if you think that's admirable to have such a communitarian way of life, well, it's not just, there's a dyad here. Okay, so what is my judgment about the Grummet decision? I mean, you and I could get lost in the weeds for a long time. I will simply say you identify 3 principles in that decision, just to remind everyone. It was a very confusing decision, in part because this was at a pivotal transitional time, 1994, as the Supreme Court was beginning to become more conservative and move away from the era of the liberal Warren Court, which is kind of the high point of both liberal integrationism and strict separation between church and state. It was becoming more conservative, not nearly as conservative. It was moving towards where we are today. And so there were more than 3 different rationales. Abner identified there's this anti-favoritism principle. The problem here is that one community was singled out, which is very different from the anti-fusion principle, which says the constitutional defect here is that there's an intermingling of religious and political power, which is different yet again from the 3rd principle Abner identified, which is this anti-religious gerrymandering problem. The problem here is that the state was using religion as the state was differentiating people by religion and drawing political boundaries, in this case around a public school district. And essentially Kennedy's idea here is that's just as bad as a racial gerrymander. But there was actually also a 4th principle. And to put my cards on the table, you've succeeded in outing me. And it was really only Justice Stevens, although he was joined by the very newly appointed Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was an anti-separatism principle, which was different from the anti-gerrymandering principle. Stevens alone said the problem here is that this is a community that is insulating its children from exposure to the outside world. And this really does connect to the exit problem. And that's wrong. And the state shouldn't be enabling that. The state shouldn't be providing a group with the power, the political power, to shelter its members, and in particular its children, but also adult members, from exposure to other ways of life. That's not the same as the
It's funny that I should have forgotten the Stevens.
Yeah. So,
Brown.
and I have to say, that's my favorite opinion. I'll come back to that because I want to just
Justice Stevens, who people shouldn't, I mean, not only did I clerk him, but he had a very strong establishment clause view and a very weak free exercise clause view, just to be clear about that.
So I'll come back to that in a moment, and then I'll wrap up and let David have a crack at the judgment problem. The 3rd question is, do we have a view? Is Kiryas Joel, it's still there, a religious establishment, a state form, as a governmental unit that is supporting a particular religion?
Or being run by one.
Yeah, or being run by one, right? Which is really the fusion idea. Interestingly, the claim that it is was made by no party more vigorously than dissidents inside the community. So actually, Abner mentioned, this is a community that has been presented to courts, but they always found procedural reasons to avoid. It's never been resolved. it was presented, and very interestingly, in very evocative terms, it was dissidents inside the village. That is Satmars, who are sort of echt Satmars. They're more, they think the Satmars who are running the village aren't being Satmar enough. They're not being separatist enough. And they have gone to court repeatedly claiming the village is a theocracy, right? But for all kinds of procedural reasons, the court, and those of you who might be, it's Judge Rakoff, who was the judge to whom this question has been presented over and over. So what do we think? Well, that is in a certain way the hardest question. And I don't think we have a complete answer, but I guess what I would say is, why is it a hard question? Because any definite, what counts as how much religious influence, either on the part of voters, and then their elected leaders are responsive to the values and interests of the voters, or on the part of office holders themselves, is no degree of reliance on religious beliefs or religious values permitted? If so, well, then I guess all the civil rights statutes have to be deemed to be unconstitutional, because they were motivated by the Reverend Martin Luther King's religious vision, right? So that can't be right. And I think part of the reason why this issue has been avoided, it really is the hard question of the religion clause. It's not only that the Satmars had incentives to avoid confronting the issue, judges had their own incentive. It is, in a way, an unresolvable issue. What I am inclined to say, to get to the last point, and you make this point yourself, Abner, in your wonderful article, I think the question is really not, it's the same thing, the question that was asked about when Amy Coney Barrett was a nominee. She's religious. Is that a problem? Well, no. Everyone has personal beliefs that they bring with them to whatever job they have. And there is no such thing as neutrality. We've established that. And for some people, they're religious beliefs, and for some people, they're non-religious beliefs. You could have a separatist community, just as separatist, just as insular, just as controlling on the inside, just as limiting of the members' exposure to the outside world, and thereby maybe depriving them of the conditions, namely both sort of the conditions to develop cognitively and economic and whatever other conditions are necessary to be able to exercise a meaningful choice as to whether to stay or to leave. You could have a non-religious version of such a highly insular, highly intensive community. I mean, just take all the debates about Christian scientists who originally did not define themselves as a religion and only started to define themselves. And so there's all these semantics. Are they a religion? Are they not a religion? Who cares? What matters is not whether it's religious or non-religious. I think what really matters is, A, is it a community that, while it promotes and transmits to the next generation and has robust cultural institutions and maybe even non-state legal institutions that are expressive of a distinctive culture that subscribes to values that are different from the mainstream culture, including liberal ones? Is such a community also providing children with the minimum degree of education and knowledge about the outside world and other ways of life, with the ability to develop cognitively, to be able to make it? If that's what we worry about, then it doesn't really matter whether it's religious or non-religious. That's what we're worrying about. If what we're worrying about is being exclusionary, and by the way, people are as desirous of not having to live in or with this community as the Satmars are desirous of separating themselves out. The boundary line around the village originally included some non-Satmars, and they said, get us out of here, right? So if exclusion is deemed to be a problem, and so I'll just finish with this, I think it is a problem. I think that, and I think we're at a moment where we see that democracy cannot survive if all members of society are not informed enough to know about people who are different from them. And if they are not taught, so I think the state has an interest in making sure that all children are taught to respect other cultures and other values, and to respect the rights, and to feel a sense of obligation to people outside their own community. You might call that super liberalism, right? It's a form of liberalism that makes no pretense to neutrality, that doesn't deny that that is a mode of, let's say, state enforced education and state requirements about how the powers of local government are exercised. That does undeniably pose an existential threat to cultures that define themselves precisely by the insistence on having no such exposure, no sense of respect for or duty to people outside of them. So that is my cards on the table. You've succeeded in outing me. Not necessarily the same view as my co-author, but we're
So
fine.
David's going to speak, and then Magda, we need time for Q&A, correct? Okay. And we finish at 7:15, just to set
okay,
the
so
parameters.
I'm going to
Okay.
respond, I hope briefly, to just 2 points. I'm going to translate your first question into a question about subject position, which is, I think, what you were trying to get at. And Nomi spoke to this, and I would just say that Kiryas Joel is a kind of Rorschach test. It elicits very strong views, really in polarized fashion. And I have to say that one of the great sources of gratification in writing this book is that the two main competing factions within Kiryas Joel, we heard from representatives of both, and they both seemed to like the book. So that was like really sort of a shocking and gratifying moment in the reception of the book. And we saw how this Rorschach test operated in the very first talk we gave. It was by Zoom, and it was January 19th, 2022. It was the UJ Federation here in New York City, together with a Jewish Week. And there are 900 people who logged in and 130 questions. Mercifully, we got to none of them. This is our first talk. And if you think I went on too long today, you really had to see that. 65 of which were, why do you join the ranks of anti-Semites in denigrating and vilifying this community? And 65 of which were, why do you not appreciate the beauty and integrity of this glorious community? And we understood at that point that this is a subject. I mean, we knew it before.
No. The other was why? How can you defend and justify?
How can you defend?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. How can you defend?
Yeah.
How can you defend?
Yeah.
How can you defend? Yes. How can you defend?
So
Sorry.
irritatingly neutral.
Right. And it is ironic because I have actually spent a large portion of my career pointing out the subject positions of historians and the degree of opacity or lack thereof in their work, and sort of pointing out the kind of self-delusion at times about how engaged they were as scholars enmeshed in a community with very strong senses of how to steer that community to a different place. And yet when we came to this book and subject, we didn't come to a blank slate. We came to a phenomenon that was shrouded in misunderstanding. And not just misunderstanding, but often gross stereotypes. And I'm reminded of this because a mere 3 weeks ago at a forum at Nomi's institution, a very eminent scholar summoned up a term that has frequently been used by enemies of the community to refer to its residents' degree of dependence by calling them parasites. sort of a term that very powerfully reverberates in the nomenclature of anti-Semitism. And so we understood that this was a phenomenon that was just shrouded in misunderstanding and a very coarse stereotyping. And so I think we felt not just a scholarly, but I would say in my case, a moral obligation to peel off the layers of misunderstanding such that we could understand that A, the people who inhabit this community are not aliens who come from outer space, as people often assume. And B, this is not a phenomenon without precedent in the history of the United States. So in some sense, there was a commitment to writing the moral balance in ways that, really required steering between very strongly held competing sensibilities. There was a sense we had to humanize this subject in a very profound way. Satmar Hasidim are people. Like this was we heard many times, these people are so awful. They're this, they're that, they're parasitical. I mean, this is what we encountered in the early stages of presenting. And I would say that ethical obligation to humanize was front and center. But once we completed the book, and then on September 11th, 2022, when the New York Times published its first piece on the Hasidic education system in the New York area, pointing to the fact that Hasidic schools had gotten $1 billion in government funding over the previous 4 years, not only did a lot of people ask us, well, what do you think now? But we felt at a point where we had a somewhat different task. It wasn't to peel away the layers of misunderstanding. It was to say something about this phenomenon, which is to say the receipt of $1 billion of state and federal funding and the failure to adhere to the minimal demand, which was to meet the state Department of Education substantial equivalence.
So in theory, that demand would have been present with or without the funding because the state has to set minimal educational standards.
Right. And all the more striking given this enormous government commitment. And that prompted us actually to write a piece in the Atlantic, in which I think that the title of which was something like "Private Religious Schools Also Have Public Obligations," something like that, in which we sort of came out of that prior stance, that prior subject position. Again, which I would say was not beginning at a point of neutrality, given that ethical obligation that I mentioned, but in which we arrived at a more affirmative stance in some sense.
Which month? Or is it just like
September 18th, September, a week after the first,
I'll make
September
sure
18th, in which we said, and this was, I just want to pick up on something that we said at the end. This was a perspective born of January 6, 2021, when it became clear to us that democracy in any meaningful sense, or the commonweal in any meaningful sense, will not survive, has no chance of surviving if we fail to require society that each individual and collective throw in some part of its, to use Rousseau's term, individual will into the general will. There has to be some commitment to the volonté générale, the general will. And for us, that meant that this required basic instruction in English, math, civics, including in the Hasidic system. And we arrived at the conclusion, and many of our friends in the community would disagree, that this would not lead to the collapse of this very strong yeshiva system. It could survive it. And I pointed out that, in fact, when the Satmar educational system began to be built in the early 1950s, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum himself said, here we will teach English and some basic diet of secular subjects, because that's essential for, in his case, not serving the commonweal, but economic sustenance. He said, if that is not your preference, then go to another school. So there was an interesting historical precedent, and we thought it had real applicability in the here and now, not on the grounds that he argued, but on the grounds of the sustainability of the American system.
Overlapping consensus there.
Mhm.
Thank you guys so much. Magda, should I take questions from the floor? Or do you have questions online that you'd like to ask?
One from the, or two from the floor, and then I'll tie into a couple
Okay.
from the deck. So I see Rebecca and then I see someone.
And Aaron over here
Yeah,
also.
so let's take
Okay.
three.
Okay.
Thank you. My field actually is education, special education. And in New York City, when you've got kids in special education, which both of my kids were in special education, K through 12, they get provided buses for transportation, special buses, matrons on them and everything. And those buses just pierce the district boundaries, you know, the bus company sets up a route. And so the kids from all sorts of different schools, they're going to get their here dropped off there and so on and so forth. But I remember back when there were these special education buses and the community of Kiryas Joel would wanted them stopped because they were picking up their children. But if they had one child who was in special education and the only other child was of the opposite sex, then they had to have two buses. And it got all entangled. It's like keeping it kosher. I don't know how that turned out, but I thought that really struck at the middle, right at the heart of what some of the main issues were.
Mhm.
You have
Do
a.
you want to collect some questions? Or?
No, let's just
Okay,
let's
so-
just
so-
let's just
so-
go quickly through some. How about that? We do quick
Yeah.
hits.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
So I mean, just you're remembering that the events that really first brought the village of Kiryas Joel into conflict and into legal conflict with the outside community were over school buses, public school buses transporting kids to schools, and over special education. But those were actually two separate. So first came the controversy over public school buses in New York State, as in many states. This has been deemed to be constitutional since the late 1940s. If states want to have a policy of providing publicly funded transportation to transport children to private schools, including religious schools, the Supreme Court over half a century ago said that's not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so that is the case in New York. And so there were public school buses, and you're right that early in the history of Kiryas Joel, the very first conflict that they got into with the regional school district was over actually having female bus drivers. Subsequently, not long after, came the controversy over special education, which raised many similar issues. And it was really a dilemma that was born with the passage of the federal law in 1975, guaranteeing state-funded, state-provided special educational services for every children with special needs, which created this quandary that I think really is a paradox, or it's not, you know, is it permissible for these state-funded and administered services to be provided to children who attend private religious schools? Does that violate the Establishment Clause? If so, then are you saying every child with special needs has to go to public school? Well, that violates other constitutionally protected rights.
So we'll just do questions and answers real quick.
Yeah, and then.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on the Satmar dissidents who opposed the public school, because that was very interesting. It was a case like a strange bedfellows. So there was ACLU, ADL opposed it, and then you have these ultra Orthodox, like the far right, far left allies. It also appears to me that they've been vindicated with the latest, because they were saying, like, they're the true libertarians. They're saying, we don't want your money. Like, I think they say the government which gives you money could take away your freedom. So I think the dissidents are now saying, see, we were right. If you would have listened to us back in 1994, the government wouldn't be telling us how to educate our children. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Quick response on that. Great question.
Yeah. Sure. So it was a strange alliance. You're absolutely right. You know, it's interesting. A question we often ask, I'm going to just sort of answer your question with a question, is what would it be like if the dissidents actually had political power? Would the calculus look different? And one of the reasons I'm asking that is because we tell of an extraordinary scene in the book in which the dissidents we're involved in a legal matter, not relating to public education, but to restrictions on building a synagogue in Kiryas Joel, in which they seem to have the opportunity to do what they said they had wanted to do all along, to dissolve the village. And at the moment when they had the capacity to do that, they pulled back and decided not to, which raises for us the question of, what were their motivations and what might they have done if they had been in power? We don't know the answer to that question. You could say that they are the truest followers of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, but whose original vision of the community was not to create a legally recognized municipality, but what he called a Shtetl, a self-contained spiritual enclave. And yet, Joel Teitelbaum agreed to the creation of a legally recognized municipality. Now, you could say after his stroke in 1968, he wasn't in full command of his cognitive powers.
Yeah, maybe he was. Maybe he knew this was the best bet.
And maybe he was. And I tend to think he was. He understood that this was the best vehicle delivery system for sustaining and preserving the Satmar way.
Fascinating. Aaron, and then from the web. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about the word unprecedented, which you used at the beginning, and which I think is right, but the vector of Kiryas Joel has many elements that are not unprecedented. So American local government, which began as sort of private association, Jewish groups that run taxation, schools, welfare systems, and courts, look sort of like localities, right? And so that's not unprecedented. And there are at least two jurisdictions in our area, the municipality of Lakewood and the school districts and the 5 towns on Long Island, where the apparatus of political control has been used by Orthodox majorities without isolationism. So I guess my question to you is it the vector that makes it unprecedented, or is it really that element of isolation, geographic isolationism and utter exclusion? And I really would, if we have time, to hear from both of you, because I want to know the Jewish history answer to that, and I want to know that.
There's a very interesting answer, which Nomi just wrote down.
Only in America.
It's
In other words,
America.
yes,
It's
there are
America.
other examples in America, but the point is in Europe, in the Ottoman Empire. Now, we have gotten pushback on that thesis, where there are scholars of Jewish history who say, well, really, wasn't the Kihila or isn't the Jewish millet? So we could get into that and we could debate, and it's a fair challenge. But the example, we're not saying this is we're saying the opposite. We're saying in the history of America, Jews and many other religious subcommunities have been able to form their own governmental entities or quasi-governmental entities in something like a child welfare system. And Kiryas Joel is not the only or even the first Jewish example. In fact, the formation of the village of Kiryas Joel was predated, in some ways inspired by the formation of the village of New Square, which is a kind of smaller mini Kiryas Joel. So your point is well taken. But just to reiterate, our claim is that this is a quintessentially American phenomenon that Jews, not only the Satmars, have been able to benefit from in ways, creating opportunities that really we think did not exist in Europe or the Ottoman Empire or elsewhere around the globe.
And I, as a historian, will agree with you that this is absolutely an American story, but it also shows the community very much as separate as they are, integrated into the American system and able to live and work within American legal system in ways that, by appearance, they seem to be very insular and isolated. And at that level, that is not unprecedented. That is something that we see historically in Europe, that Jews were very much integral and integrated into the legal system of all the various states, even in the pre-modern period. But what is unprecedented is the creation of the segregated Jewish only. It's almost like creation of the literary Shtetl in reifying the literary Shtetl without. So we have a couple of questions. One is about the questions of attitudes and conflicts and strife with which David started, and someone says that there is a popular idea in Haredism that when they hate us, they remind us who we are. And therefore being too comfortable and having too easy life is being accepted by non-Jewish majority is actually not good. So did that appear in your research? And the other question is I had a question and it ties into some of the questions on the how does the legal history of Kiryas Joel fit in the context of what we're seeing now and the use and abuse of the religious right movement in law?
Okay, I'll take a crack at the first. And I want to tie it to what you said about the experience of Jewish communities in Europe. I'm a big believer in the wisdom of an article, actually a lecture given by the late great Jewish historian Gershon Cohen, which you know well, Magda, called The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History from 1966, in which the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary seemed to be extolling the benefits of assimilation, which in the eyes of many in the Satmar community is one of the gravest threats that the community faces. Cohen's argument was throughout Jewish history, Jews have continually absorbed and contended with the social norms, practices, and cultures of the societies in which they find themselves. And that work of integration and then retraction creates a kind of cultural muscle that sustains Jewish communities, in the absence of which Jews would have been fossilized and ossified centuries or millennia ago. And that is what prompted us to make the argument that what we see in Kiryas Joel is a process of what we call, and we've been criticized for this, and legitimately so, unwitting assimilation. That is to say, there's an ongoing process of absorption of social, legal, political norms of the surrounding society that we see even a community that regards assimilation as the chief threat to its existence. Certainly very evident in the legal and political realms, but we think also in the cultural realm as well. And yet, what gives that term its power is the declared opposition to assimilation and the belief that while the United States is, in the words of the community, a kingdom of grace, a malchus shel chesed, Satmar Jews and other Haredim are still in a state of exile, of golus, which means a state of enmity sort of surrounds them. And so we tried to capture that belief, that complicated belief that, one, we're in golus, we're in exile. Two, we nonetheless live in a rather unique setting, a malchus shel chesed, unique in the annals of Jewish existence in the diaspora. And three, we have to ward off these forces that are seeking to, in some sense, destroy us by swallowing us into their culture. And that helps us understand the phenomenon of unwitting assimilation.
Last word for Nomi?
Yeah, so I'm going to actually link your question about assimilation to your question about the religious right. I think you're absolutely right. We're both in complete agreement that what we see in the story of the Satmars in America is what we've seen throughout Jewish history, as David said, which is the ability of Jews to assimilate, or we might simply say adapt to whatever the culture and the rules of the game of the host society are. So if you're in the, Austro-Hungarian, empire, you learn the rules of that game, and then when they come to America, they learn the rules of the game of American-style democratic interest group politics. When they first arrive, the game of American interest group politics is it's also characterized by all of the features of post-war liberalism. This is the era, right? I mean, they're really taking rise late 40s, the 50s. This is the this is the high point of liberal integrationism, really, this is when the Supreme Court, for the first time, is formulating the doctrine of separation of church and state, belief in the value of separation as being good for religion as well as good for society. That's how we need to protect religion from the incursions of the state. So, and the third element of that liberal trinity, if you will, right? Integration, separation of church and state, belief in public schools as the site, the vehicle. But of course, we'll also allow people to opt out and go to private schools. And so they adapted to that. So David described that, when the Rebbe first created the school system, he said, well, there's gonna be secular education in the schools along with, the major diet of Talmud Torah. Why? Yes, for reasons because he believed that men need to work, but I think those are the rules of the game here. That's what you do. And so the real question, to go to the rise of the religious right, and you talked about, some would say that the Satmar dissidents, they're the real libertarians, right? We're the truest, don't take the money. And then we don't have to, comply with the conditions. We don't have to comply with the strings attached. Of course, currently, right, throughout, for over 100 years, it has been well established that the state's power to regulate private schools and homeschools is not contingent on taking the money, right? Which is to say, although they're very powerful strains of libertarianism, that's definitely a big American tradition, it's always coexisted with counter values, more we might say civic Republican values, limiting the rights of parents and the rights of private communities. So currently, actually, you don't get to opt out of the obligations to comply with secular educational requirements or special education if you don't take the money. But the rules of the game are changing with the rise of the religious right. And we don't know, will this Supreme Court come to embrace the radical educational agenda of the religious right, which is total deregulation of private and home schools, but we get equal funding. I think the Satmars, this is my point about what is it that we are judging. They adapt to what the rules of the game are. As America has gone in a more conservative, libertarian direction, they've adapted to that and they've benefited from that. But I believe that if America shifted back towards a more liberal integrationist, less libertarian, if that had been the counterfactual, they would have adapted to that.
So thank you guys. Back to Magda.
Yeah, so on that note of change and adaptation in history, I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll join us still for these programs in April and then in May. And if you're not on our mailing list, but you RSVP, you will be on our mailing list.
All right,
Thank you so
Magda.
much for